symbolically, all music is protest music. All jazz, certainly, but really all creative music. I mean, the act of creation goes against many of the values that suppressive regimes have looked to wipe out.
Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. You are who you are, and that was trombonist Ryan Keberle on the intrinsic protest and freedom of improvised music. Ryan has been active on the New York scene for nearly 20 years, which is really saying something, considering he's still a young man by many standards. He's worked extensively with both the Maria Schneider Orchestra and indie singer-songwriter Sufjan Stevens, each of whom have influenced his own music enormously. Ryan's project, Catharsis, which features the great singer Camila Meza, has a new record coming out later this spring, but I'm here to give you a preview right now.
If I told you here but now is all we have, would you still hear me? What if we are blind, all of us, imagining there was a time when great was real? Our weakest link is fear of losing greatness. Get on stage before the curtain falls, before the blindness opens fire. We are here to elevate to greater. Find the common, shine a light, become the water, put out the fire. Find the common, shine a light, become the water, put out the fire. Find the common, shine a light, become the water, put out the fire. Find the common, shine a light, become the water, put out the fire.
We started out by exploring the past, present, and future of trombone playing, the legacy of great bone players and arrangers, and why there's a revolution taking place with the instrument and the way it's being played today. You sort of defy all stereotypes, assumptions about trombone players. First of all, you're like a very happy person. And second of all, you know, you're like working a lot. I mean, that may not be a fair thing to say about trombone players in general. That may be like a horrible stereotype.
It is. Some of the busiest people I know are trombonists. Now, that's not to say all trombonists are super busy, but some of the busiest people I know, for many reasons, maybe one, trombonists tend to be industrious because they play the trombone. Number two, many trombonists, this is an historic thing, are amazing composers and arrangers. I did a big band concert once, many years ago, where every song was arranged by a different trombone player, historically. Talking Bob Brookmeyer, J.J. Johnson, many of the Nelson Riddle, Bill Rousseau, who arranged for Stan Kenton's band. And the list goes on and on and on, and people you didn't even know were trombonists are on that list. And I've thought a lot about why that is. For me personally, as an arranger, and arranging is one of my passions these days. I think it has a lot to do with where we sit in the big band.
You're talking physically or in the range?
Physically. And range, but physically in particular. And the people I just listed, these are all people who got their start in big bands. And historically that was our school as jazz musicians. And sitting next to the rhythm section, number one. Number two, sitting in front of the trumpets but behind the saxes, so you hear everything that's happening very clearly. And then also in terms of the register where we sit, we typically don't get the melody parts, so our ears aren't distracted by those lead melody lines, but instead we get the counter melodies, we get the supporting harmony, the building blocks more so of the music. So I think that has a lot to do with it.
And also find that those sort of sweet notes, the sweet stuff that sort of turns it from good to great, from pretty to beautiful. And
that's what I'm interested in, especially after having played Gil Evans' music regularly over the last 5 or 6 years with Ryan Truesdale's project, the Gil Evans project. It's incredible sitting where we are and listening in the way we just mentioned, how every part in the band, in every single measure, has some beautiful detail that you don't hear when you're listening out front. Certainly not on first listen. I mean, there'd be no way to hear all these details. It's incredible, the attention to detail he puts. And you don't recognize it on first or second or even 10th listen, but that's why that music has such character. and it swings its ass off. You know, of course, that's a given. But yeah, I think that has a ton to do with it. Like you said, here's a completely different take. A good friend of mine named Steve Moore, who played keys in Sufjan's band, and also a great trombonist based in Seattle. He has a theory that given the trombone's resonance capabilities, which is why we're always put into these big fat chords, because the instrument resonates with other trombonists in a way that no other instrument does. Maybe the only similarity would be like male human voices, you know, where you create an octave and a perfect fifth and suddenly the entire room is shaking with overtones. But his theory is that because of the overtone, the propensity for overtones, even with a single instrument, just the way it resonates, that, you know, it's physically creating something in our bodies, our minds, that creates this awareness of sound and timbre, you know?
Yeah.
It's deep.
No, it is deep, but I hear what you're saying, and by extension what you're saying is that the overtones that are created by the instrument, if you tune into them, put you in touch with a whole bunch of harmonic possibilities. Right? I mean, if you're hearing the extension of the overtone series, or you're feeling it when you're playing.
That's a whole other world.
Do you think part of that may be that there's no valves or buttons, that it's an instrument like the human voice that is untethered to fixed tuning in that way?
Yeah, well, that's definitely one of the reasons most super successful trombonists have great ears, is because you're never technically in tune.
Yeah.
You know, or you can think of it as you're always in tune, or certainly, or have the capability of always being in tune in a way that any instrument with keys or buttons doesn't. From my own perspective, like I mentioned earlier, I find that some of my trombone friends are the busiest people I know. And I think amongst horn players, because I feel like there's like kind of two worlds of musicians. You have your rhythm section players, who of course get to do all sorts of fun things, and the gigs that they do, they're getting to play constantly. And I'm a closet rhythm section player. This is one of the reasons I started Catharsis, because without the piano, the trumpet and trombone or saxophone, we get to comp. We are the harmony instrument, single note harmony instrument. And I love that. I love being a part of the band on like a consistent basis through an entire performance. So you have the rhythm section camp, and then you have the horn section camp. And there is the added benefit of being a horn section, a horn player, because, you know, you're typically getting to carry the melody. You're typically getting to take most of the solos, you know, but of the horn world, personally, I find trombones are maybe the most versatile instrument of them all, and because of that, stay quite busy. We don't get the glamorous gigs like the saxophones do. I mean, usually if it's a quartet, the horn player called is a saxophonist, and that pisses me off. You know, I mean, that's another reason I started Catharsis, is I want people to start thinking about the trombone as an instrument that can lead a band and stand out front and carry melodies and take solos on a regular basis, you know, because in 2017, that is a real possibility. There's so many great trombone soloists out there.
Do you think the level of trombone playing has improved over the years?
We are currently in the midst of a paradigm shift for jazz trombone. I think history will look back on the last 20 years as a major, major advancement in what is possible and what is expected from jazz trombone players.
Is that a result of changes in the way it's taught, equipment? Expectation?
It's a result in changes the way it's played. So it started with Steve Turre and Robin Eubanks and John Fedchock and Conrad Herwig. This is the previous generation, but people who really upped the level of jazz capability, you know, playing higher, playing faster, playing more complicated changes. Wycliffe Gordon, kind of just slightly younger than those guys, also came about, who's just a total virtuosic freak on the instrument. And so then the next generation, which is our generation, you have these trombonists who now have a model. We never had a model. I mean, JJ was amazing, Sly was amazing, but they weren't John Coltrane, they weren't Miles Davis, they weren't Chick Corea. Like, all these other instruments have these incredibly virtuosic precedents to look to, or inspirations. So now, next generation comes along, and you've got just in terms of like sheer trombone playing, you've got multiple people doing things on the trombone that have never been done before.
It's like once you realize that it's possible, then it becomes possible to a whole bunch of people.
Yep. It's so interesting how that works. You never think to practice it unless you hear someone else do it. I wouldn't include myself on that kind of virtuoso list, but I'm surrounded by these people, and so it absolutely pushes me to try to do things that I probably wouldn't typically do because musically I'm not really drawn in that direction. But, you have people like Elliot Mason and Mike Dees and Marshall Jilks. These guys are doing things on the trombone that have never been done before, just in terms of sheer technical prowess. It's incredible. It's a very exciting time to be a trombonist in jazz. But outside of jazz, that's really where the trombone shines, because historically we don't get those jazz gigs, the solo gigs, but we get called for the salsa bands always, In some salsa bands, it's just trombones. Mm-hmm. We get called for the Latin folkloric music, Brazilian folkloric music, Colombian folkloric music. We get called for the pop gigs. Any horn section gig, whether it's rock or R&B, funk, always has a trombonist, at least if they're serious about it. Every classical gig, whether it's a chamber group, brass quintet, playing Easter services, or whether it's a full orchestra, always has 3 trombones. All the big band gigs we get called for times 4. There's 4 trombones in every big band now. Every Broadway show has at least one trombonist. I do a lot of movie soundtrack recordings. I almost always have a trombone or 2 on a film score. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, unless you play lead trumpet, a lot of those scenarios don't apply. And for saxophone, forget about it. I mean, maybe bari sax in the funk horn sections. Of course, yeah, you have tenor sax in a horn section for a pop gig, but that's about it. You don't see either of those instruments in folkloric settings, Latin American or Caribbean folkloric settings nearly as often. Yeah, and I think because New York is filled with all those musics I just mentioned, there historically has been a lot of opportunity. I don't know if those opportunities are still out there. I mean, I'm not as involved as I was, but coming up for me, trombones were working, man.
You had this kind of, for a time, this dream of being the guy, the one horn soloist in a popular setting, and it just never materialized.
Yeah, I can't say I ever really fully pursued it, but my dream gig, after I realized I wasn't going to be a small group jazz band leader making a decent living, my dream gig was to be the horn player with Sting. Mm-hmm. This was back in Sting's heyday,
when Chris Bodie had the gig.
Exactly, late 90s, early 2000s.
You thought, I'm going to convince him that I'm the new Chris Bodie.
Exactly, man, Sting just doesn't know how much he needs a trombonist playing his music.
Some of it is also just visual. There's the silhouette of a trumpet in the light with a little smoke and maybe a Harmon mute pointing to the sky. That's one image.
Yeah.
To me, a trombone kind of in silhouette, I just think of Basin Street or something. You know what I mean? I immediately just go right back to a walking band.
Well, man, it's by far the most physical instrument other than bass.
Right.
By far. So much physical movement and unwieldy movements that are involved. So you're absolutely right. Now, on the flip side, I feel like because we're such a visual audience, we equate that with the musical connotation. And whereas Harmon mute trumpet, of course, is a historically sexy sound, and it's got that vibe, and of course saxophone as well. Man, trombone used to be, musically speaking, a very sexy instrument. Glenn Miller was a pop icon,
Yes.
Tommy Dorsey was a pop icon. These guys got the ladies, man.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys were rock stars. Yeah. And because they played music that was unbelievably sexy and unbelievably beautiful. And the trombone is capable of that,
And it's also capable of being kind of dirty.
Totally.
And raunchy and making you feel like you might be breaking some rules,
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a very versatile instrument. I think we're just proving our point here, It can do a lot of different things. People forget about it because, for whatever reason, it has been left out. Of some of those scenarios where we don't find the opportunity. But yeah, I mean, I hope to do my small part in changing some people's minds, over the years.
Did you sort of aspire to be and see yourself primarily as a jazz trombonist and a soloist? Is that kind of what you were leaning towards or focused on?
Definitely. Back when I was extremely naive and blind to the possibilities of what were out there, right when I moved to town. And was an undergraduate at Manhattan School of Music, that's definitely kind of how I envisioned my career as I would have hoped. Within a few months, I had a band formed there, and we were playing my original tunes and arrangements of pop tunes, basically doing what I'm still doing, just on a much smaller scale, and even went out to try to get gigs, like a kid who knows nothing about the business does.
And you were here straight off the plane from the...
Straight off the plane, man. I was from Spokane, Washington, and when we had started the semester, that was my second time on the East Coast, let alone New York City. So I knew nothing, and would go knock on restaurant doors trying to get gigs, and of course that failed miserably, and eventually started getting gigs down at the green markets, the farmers market at Union Square.
Sure.
And me and two buddies of mine would go down there every Saturday morning at like 6 a.m, get first in line to get dibs on.
Because there's cats that go down and they want a corner.
Exactly. Yeah, so we'd be the first ones there, and we'd play all morning long, and we'd make good money.
Did you ever find that there was certain material that made more money than other kinds of material?
It's funny, we never even thought about that. We were so young, just trying to learn to play our instruments, and we just would play out of the real book, and play tune. We used it as an opportunity to learn new songs, and that thought never crossed our minds.
Right, maybe there's some things that'll earn more than
others.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what I had envisioned, and I learned quickly that, hey, this is not, obviously I'm not going to pay my rent doing this, and saw that there were very few trombonists doing this. I mean, just few jazz musicians in general who are leading their own band and making money in the process. So I think that's when I started doing more sideman work, not so much consciously, but just subconsciously. You make time for other things. And that's something I had always done a lot of, was in particular big band playing. I mean, my father's a big band director. My grandfather was a big band director at a high school. So it runs in the family, and it's a genre that's very near and dear to my heart and my family's, kind of my upbringing, really. Mm-hmm. And the big bands are where all the first early doors for me opened up. And I think still to this day, that's true. I think there's probably fewer opportunities to play in big bands where you're actually making money anymore, but it's still the place you're going to open doors for a lot of reasons.
Networking.
Yeah, networking. If you're freelancing, you're going to get gigs from other instrumentalists on your instrument, other trombonists. And every big band gig you do, or every rehearsal you do for free, you just met 3 other trombonists. And inevitably, some of these guys are working and they need subs, so that's how it starts. So if you're doing a couple of big band rehearsals a week, even if you're not making any money, you're really building a network, and then of course there's 10 other people in the band that you're meeting. And but from a musical standpoint, you that's where you learn to do so many things, in terms of playing with other people, playing different genres stylistically, on specific technical adjustments that you have to make to play different styles. And you learn to listen,
Ryan Keberle, learning to listen. You don't have to do much work to learn how to listen to the Third Story podcast. Chances are you already know all you need to know, but just a review, third-story.com is the site for you. If you're fancy, follow me on Twitter and Facebook. If you're old school, write me an email. And if you're really old school, this is a podcast. This conversation in particular brings to mind a few previous episodes, including the ones with trumpeter Tatum Greenblatt, arranger Gil Goldstein, and more recently the one with bassist and composer Alexis Cuadrado. And the one with saxophonist John Ellis. I mean, basically, listen to the one with Ellis, even if it's not related to anything else, which it is, but even if it weren't, still listen to it. Listen to it like once a month. Take 2 episodes and call me in the morning. Each life is different, everyone's experience is unique like a snowflake, but there are certainly themes that emerge. I think of these conversations as both standing on their own, but also contributing to a greater good, a totality, a whole. You know what I'm saying. Here, Ryan relives his life as a sideman, how he came to discover Latin music, particularly South American music, and the effect it had on him and his eventual solo project, Catharsis. So big band was sort of home for you for a multitude of reasons. Eventually, you sort of fell in with a scene of kind of Latin big bands and world music big bands.
Yeah.
Was that intentional, or that was just what was here?
Completely unintentional. I mean, I was a kid from Spokane. I had never heard even the most mainstream of non-Western musical styles. I had no idea who the Fania All-Stars were. I had no idea what Tito Puente's music sounded like. I knew nothing about that stuff. Really, all I knew growing up was classic rock. Lots of classical music, because I do also play violin and piano, and played in orchestras and solo ensemble, all that kind of thing. And then of course jazz, and big band jazz in particular. So I knew nothing. It was just, but like what is so beautiful about New York still to this day is you meet one person from another scene, and suddenly that one relationship can turn into 20.
So who was your person?
Without a doubt, my person was Pedro Giraldo from Argentina, and one of the great composers and bassists in town. Very active, doing more tango writing now for his tango project, but one of the unsung heroes of our generation for big band writing. And he certainly gained more recognition recently, but it's just so difficult to travel with a big band, and in today's world where you really do need to travel in order to break through because of the overwhelming amount of music out there, recorded music, we never really did much outside the city. So everyone in New York, of course, knows who he is, but beyond that, it's a struggle, But he's just a brilliant guy and introduced me to so much folkloric Argentinian music, but also Venezuelan music, Brazilian music, Uruguayan music. In terms of grooves, in terms of instruments. I traveled to Argentina with him once, more of a vacation really than anything, but got to go to the source with him and really hear this music up close and in person. And yeah, I mean, it's changed who I am as a person and as a musician for sure. And actually Catharsis' last record was kind of my tribute to those experiences and writing original music and also arranging pieces from people like Pedro and other South American composers here in New York that shaped who I am, and it was by far the most rewarding project I had done to date, and in some ways the most personal project, even though it's drawing from these countries that, as I moved to New York as a 19-year-old, I knew absolutely nothing about.
Well, I get the sense the name of your project, Catharsis, is a kind of reference to this light going on for you when you got turned on to something that was so far away from where you came from physically, but so close to you personally. Is that what you're saying by calling it catharsis?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a light going on, not necessarily just for South American music or non-Western music, but just music in general, and growing up with both my parents are professional musicians. As I mentioned, my grandparents are professional musicians, and I kind of took it for granted. Not how much I liked music, but why I liked music and what music meant to me. I never really had to think about that too much because it was just always there. And it was always a given that it would be there for the rest of my life. So I think at some point moving to New York and seeing different stories and different people's backgrounds, I realized this is not a normal thing, and that's when it began to dawn on me just how powerful music can be. And in particular, it was playing with Maria Schneider's orchestra, which my first gig with her was about 11 years ago, 2006. I think that's really when the light went off, because her music connects with audiences in ways that certainly in the jazz world I've never seen anywhere else. I think in any other musical environment, the only other time I've seen that is with Sufjan, where people are in tears or ecstatic and everything in between just because of the music.
She's also had her own journey to discovering kind of influence outside of the regular jazz canon,
Big time. Well, she's by far my biggest supporter and mentor, and, having moved here so young, in some ways, I don't want to make her feel old, but, in some ways kind of a parent figure in my life growing up, and someone who I still can turn to for very honest criticism and feedback, and a very good friend. And yeah, I really look to her for inspiration. I look to her for examples, on what to do and what not to do. And she's just a very special person.
I get the sense that you are very devoted to your gig in her band, and at the same time, you're also very devoted to your solo projects, Does that ever feel like it's a conflict to keep those both active at the same time?
As a freelancer who historically, when I was doing more freelance trombone playing, would be in minimum 15 regular working bands at any given month. I never thought twice about it. Just recently, I had to sub out of a gig of hers. I think maybe 2 gigs of hers ever in 11 years I've had to sub out. So it's not very common. And if it became something more regular, I certainly would have to reconsider. Lucky for me, I'm usually booking anywhere from 6 to 12 months in advance, which is kind of the norm. Lucky for me, Maria is at a whole different echelon of organization, and she's booking 1 to 2 years in advance. So usually I know what's coming up and I can avoid it. And I do. I mean, it's like you said, my dedication to her band certainly trumps everything else. But it's, traveling, which is primarily what we do with that band now, traveling in a big band is really hard.
What is it like? There's so few opportunities to do it, as you say. What is that like?
You know, the last tour we did, there were 22 people on the road, which even a large Greyhound bus feels cramped.
Yeah.
With 22 people. So, you know, it's tough. Everything takes time. Every check-in at the hotel takes an hour to get through everybody. You know, it's tough. And as again, for someone who's doing a lot of big band work, par for the course. But for someone who's used to doing primarily small group stuff or even solo stuff, that I think also can maybe be a factor.
So you talk about this time when you were doing more freelancing and you were, you know, playing in minimum 15 bands. Over the course of that, whatever it was, decade that you were like really digging in, we met on the Jingle Date.
Yeah.
I knew that you had played in my friend's disco band.
Disco band,
Yeah.
that's right. 18-piece disco band.
And even that band is down to five traveling members now.
I know.
You had an opportunity in that period to kind of stretch outside of the jazz world and work with pop artists and work with singer-songwriters and work in show bands and that kind of stuff. What was that period like for you, and how did it like affect who you are today?
Well, it was a busy period. In some ways, busier than I am now, which is hard to believe because I feel like I'm insanely busy. But now my time is spent writing emails all day long, booking gigs.
On your own behalf.
Exactly. Lining up tour logistics. We're leaving for Europe next week. So for the 2 hours this morning, I was just putting together our itinerary. Mm-hmm. But it's extremely busy. It's mainly busy in the evenings. You know, I do have more evenings free now, which is great. That means I get to see my wife more often than I did for many years.
Yep.
It's incredibly rewarding. It's very social. You know, you're seeing other people every night, meeting new people constantly, and getting to dig into all sorts of different kinds of music. And
there's always those, you know, those names that jump off the page because they're these big pop gigs like Justin Timberlake or like the SNL band or that kind of stuff. I mean, did you play with Justin Timberlake repeatedly?
Yeah, a couple of times with Justin, usually through my SNL connection. So I actually did both of the SNL shows with Justin.
Uh-huh. Were you a regular in the SNL band?
No, I'm the regular sub.
Yeah.
So I play it about 2 times a year.
Whose chair is it?
It's Steve Toure, who was my teacher.
He was your teacher?
In undergrad.
Steve Toure does that gig every week.
Yeah. Well, they only do 24 shows a year, 2 a month.
How is that band run? How is the SNL band run, and what is it like to step into it?
So Lenny Pickett is the music director.
Yep.
Leon Pendarvis also is very involved in terms of the on-stage logistics of the band, count-offs and cut-offs.
2 badass guys, man.
The best, you know, and so, man, it's the best, you know, to step into a band like that that's been working for so long, a well-oiled machine, best musicians on the planet, also just incredibly good people, you know, really great communities. It's like a family. It is a family. Lenny is another one of these people who I'm very lucky to be able to call a mentor, and someone who is not afraid to give me his honest opinion. You know, it's hard to find honest feedback these days, you know. And
why is that? What do you mean?
Well, you know, I'm like most of us, extremely self-critical. And when I make a record that I'm really happy with, I want to know from someone I respect what could be better, you know? And Lenny is definitely that person. He will tell me what he thinks could be better about it. And I love that. You know, I respect that about him. It's so hard to find that.
Do you agree with him?
Not always. Not always. Yeah. But most of the time he has really good points.
Yeah. What takeaway is there from working with somebody like Justin Timberlake, who's like having to operate on a couple of levels at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Like obviously a musical level, and I think that he really is musically right on.
Yeah,
you know?
he is.
And he's a serious musician, and he's elevating in general pop music. I think he keeps it at a high level. Yep. At the same time, he's an entertainer. He has to reach, you know, the back of the house. He's got to speak to everybody. He's got an image. What is it like to watch that from the stage and see how that's being managed?
I was fairly young when the first time I worked with him. It was just realizing that there are all of these things that he has to contend with. I'd never thought about that.
Yeah.
And to see him do it with such effortlessness was eye-opening. You know, I mean, this is the level. There's absolutely no sheer luck involved with his success. You know, his success is a direct result of his hard work and his natural abilities and his willingness to put in the time, man. So that for me was the biggest takeaway. And usually in the pop world, that's usually the takeaway. You know, it's because it's fun. Oh, hey, these guys are good musicians. Actually, that's always fun. But to realize all the other things they have to think about and worry about and contend with on a daily basis, and then still be able to bring this high level of musicianship Yeah, it puts things in perspective for us, who obviously are doing things very differently, but hoping to achieve similar results. A lot of the pop experiences for me were those aha moments when I realized how much more there is than what we typically think about as jazz musicians.
Yeah.
For me, that was really looking back on the payoff. It really had to do with listening, and just becoming a better listener. And of course, I never thought about it in those terms at the time, but that's really what it does. Playing with so many different people and so many different projects and so many different genres, you have to develop an ability to hear details in music that you would otherwise not have to. And, everybody hears music in different ways. And that's something I'm really interested in these days, is how we all experience music so differently.
What do you mean?
I can just speak for myself. Just the way that I hear music has evolved drastically over the last 20 years. I can give a very specific example, say swing patterns of drummers. I never really used to hear the subtle differences between, say, Philly Joe and Jimmy Cobb, and now I do, clearly.
What do you think they are?
Well, with Philly, I'm going to say he's got a much kind of tighter swing pattern to his a lot of the terms we use. It's so hard to put it into words.
No, I know what you mean.
A little bit bouncier, and if you wanted to get into it, I think his upbeat maybe is delayed a little bit more. And
it's closer to the downbeat.
To the next downbeat, exactly, where Jimmy Cobb has a kind of more relaxed. I mean, oftentimes Jimmy Cobb doesn't even play the upbeat. A lot of quarter notes, in his pattern.
It is incredible how a quarter note can swing.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a guy play 4 quarter notes.
Yeah.
And they can swing,
yeah.
And another guy play 4 quarter notes and they don't swing,
yeah.
And there's never a dotted eighth in there.
Yeah.
And you go, how is it possible that one set of quarter notes swings and the other one doesn't?
Man, music
what is that?
It's magical, and to be able to hear that is something that not everyone gets to do, and especially younger musicians. And I could talk about this forever because I think it ties into education as well.
And you
which
teach
is what
as well.
I do. But all these details that some people hear, some people don't hear, but then also I guess the other big thing in terms of how we listen to music differently is what are we drawn to? Because no one's hearing everything in terms of the layers of instruments and the layers of different events occurring at the same time. And in the jazz world, I'm going to generalize here, I find that people are drawn towards, well, number one, the soloist, and number two, in terms of what they're listening for, the execution, the technical execution of that soloist, especially if it's your instrument, which is why, I just played a gig last night celebrating Slide Hampton's 85th birthday at Jazz Lincoln Center, and I think it's the most trombonists in the room I've ever played for.
Wow.
There are like well over 30 trombonists in the room, which is cool, but trombonists are listening to trombonists, and they're listening to technically specific things that maybe they'd like to do better or they can't do at all,
And do you feel at this stage in your career that there's a different kind of expectation, or people are listening to you slightly differently than they might have a decade ago? I mean, your name is appearing on certain lists that it didn't used to appear on. And
yeah, absolutely. And the problem with that is that's not how I listen to music at all. For me, I'm feeling the music before I listen to it. And when I'm listening to it, I'm so much more interested in the subtleties, the bass lines and the drummer's swing feel, and the way the pianist is comping and the interaction on stage and the arrangements and how the arrangement allows for the written material and the improvised material to mingle and to coexist. And there's so many other things, and like I said, first and foremost, though, there's just the emotion. It's sometimes, it can be somewhat frustrating as someone who hears music in that way and tries to write music that does those things.
Yes.
But typically playing in a jazz setting, and it's something I'd love to be able to kind of find new audiences, and it's something I actively work on with kind of marketing things, and it's something that Maria did. Her audiences are not primarily jazz players.
Yeah.
They might be jazz fans, but for the most part, her audiences are music fans.
Well, I think that speaks to a real fundamental question in jazz today.
I would agree with that.
We cannot only make music for other musicians. If that is the audience, we're caught in a feedback loop and there's no way out.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. Well, especially as the general audience becomes less and less educated or informed.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a nasty coexisting set of
Yeah.
circumstances.
So how do you do that? I mean, how do you... My dad refers to it as getting out of the jazz ghetto. He's trying to break out of the jazz ghetto.
Man, I'm with him on that. It's really hard, man, because in many ways the gigs that are kind of our breakout gigs, so to speak, are usually jazz gigs, jazz festivals, right? Now, the nice thing about that is although jazz festivals typically tend to program successful jazz musicians, other than the mainstream artists that are selling their tickets, which are usually not jazz at all. But the nice thing is audiences there usually aren't the same super highly educated musician audience that we have here in New York. So I'm excited for that. We did our first big jazz festival last year, which went really well.
With Catharsis.
With Catharsis, in Italy, and we're going to do the Canadian jazz festivals here on the East Coast this summer. So I'm really excited for that, and in some ways it's time for us to experiment, And for the most part, I don't think we're going to do much different, because that's kind of how, for me personally, I try to approach every performance, and that's certainly how I've written the music and created the whole project.
It's interesting because you talk about coming out of the schools of big bands and having learned so much from Maria Schneider, and that's a heavily composed book, and you are clearly drawn to some emotional truth that you're trying to get to, and in Catharsis, it's very open. It's pianoless. It seems pretty... It's arranged, but it seems kind of it feels spontaneously arranged a lot of times.
That's good to hear, because that's what we're going for.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, it speaks to what I've learned from the jazz world as well. We've talked so much about what I learned from other worlds, but what makes jazz throughout its history so unique is its ability to foster creativity and spontaneity on stage, and that's what historically audiences have always been drawn to, other than its danceability, which is no longer really a thing. Having played in so many big bands over the years, that's not something that I personally got to experience as often, because most of the time in a big band, you're playing, as you said, prearranged material. So it took me a while to first of all realize that, and then to try to figure out how to incorporate that into Catharsis. But I think that's one of the things that does connect with non-jazz listeners and uneducated listeners. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just most Americans are uneducated when it comes to jazz. It's just a fact, is they connect with that spontaneity. They feel the energy it's palpable, that is on stage amongst the musicians.
I think of it often as risk also.
It's exactly what it is. It's 100% risk. And to see people consistently taking those risks and landing on their feet, it's very exciting. And in some ways, you can tie that into, say, like technical virtuosity, which is something that educated listeners are listening for. It's the same. You're getting off on the same idea in that you're seeing someone do something very hard or very risky and succeeding.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, they are two sides of the same coin. One side, you have the idea that people are having an opportunity up close to see a very high level of anything happening.
Totally.
In this case, it's, execution on the trombone, but it's inspiring, and it's also, it kind of hits you hard when you realize what must have gone into this moment in front of me right now. Yeah. On the other hand, I think if there's any way to make your audience complicit in what's happening, they enter more deeply.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the hardest things about delivering high-level executed stuff that requires a lot of preparation, that it's hard to then feel that you are part of that moment.
That's exactly right.
So what I do feel in your group that I really like is kind of both,
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I'm going for, and that's what Maria does so well. I mean, her music is so sophisticated. Yeah. And you have the jazz heads who are just obsessed with her various voicings and different timbres she gets in her arrangings and her different harmonic ideas. But then you have the non-jazz fans who are just enraptured by the story that her music tells and the journey it takes these listeners on. And as I said, I mean, there certainly are other jazz musicians who are capable of that, and usually they're the ones headlining jazz festivals. I mean, there's no coincidence there. I think what we need to be careful of, because I see it in the generation younger than us, the next generation, is I think they're also aware of this feedback loop, as you called it, and that's good. There's definitely this conscious movement towards making jazz more accessible, but oftentimes I see them taking the easy way out because there's so many ways to make jazz accessible by simplifying it in some way, and that's not what I'm interested in, because that's never what jazz has been about. In the act of simplification, you almost always remove some of that risk. You know,
I mean, on the other hand, there was no way to grow up on jazz in a vacuum in our life.
That's right.
There probably was a time when the cats who played jazz, it's like really all they ever heard. But
that's a good point.
We couldn't be like that.
Yeah.
And the generation after us, even more so. Like they had to hear everything. There's no way to hide in a cave and only hear jazz.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. I mean, for sure. And I love the way that other styles have informed my own music, and certainly, the next generation. That's the key word of the last few years is mashup. You know?
Right, exactly.
Young
Totally.
kids love mashups.
But it does, I fear, move away from any real commitment to I mean that's in its worst case. It's like it's not committed to anything.
Exactly. Well, and like I said, it also like puts the chicken before the egg, because if you're a jazz musician, if what you really want to do is be a jazz musician, and why would you be making music and calling it jazz if that's not the case? Because that's the last label you want to put on a music if you're looking to make money, right? But if you're looking towards all these other genres first, and you're not taking from jazz what it has to offer us historically, you're missing out on all these important components, the risk being one of the big ones, right? The spontaneity, you can call that authenticity. Some people would hear me say that and equate it with some kind of genre-specific thing, which is not at all. I mean, 40 years ago, jazz was already super experimental.
Totally.
So it's not a traditionalist attitude. It's just someone kind of paying their dues.
Right.
Or not.
This question about labeling yourself jazz if you're looking to get rich or whatever to move ahead, I've talked to some other folks about it. You know, I talked to Alan Hampton about it last year.
I heard that podcast. Yeah.
One of the things that he said was that he found it more difficult to break out of jazz than you might expect.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And there is a community. And it's an interesting question how you break out of jazz when the fact is it is a community.
But having this conversation actually at this very moment as we decide which radio marketing firm to use for this next record, because this next record is definitely not jazz through and through. It's going to, any mainstream jazz station wouldn't give this record a second listen.
You don't think so?
I don't, because there's just aesthetically, it's so different from what they are used to hearing. Now, there are definitely those more experimental jazz stations who I think will love it, hopefully, and certainly will go there. But then trying to find maybe other genres that might be interested, not probably in the whole album, but maybe specific tracks.
Man, the times are changing, I think, is, to me, jumped off that record.
Oh, thank you so much, man.
Come gather around people wherever you roam, and admit that the waters around you have grown, and accept it that soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are a-changing.
But man, Becca Stevens, Jose James, these are still jazz artists.
Exactly. That's what's so interesting to me. And I think your point is a really good one. It's the community of jazz is so tightly knit in a good way, and such a strong and loving community. But it's interesting to me, I mean, maybe in some ways because of the tight-knit sense of the community, but also because of its relatively small size, it still is easier to exist in the jazz world than it would be in any other world. And I guess for me, I'm not so much, what I've learned through this process the last couple of weeks even, is I don't think I'm looking to rebrand myself or to enter in some other world, because I mean, man, I'm a jazz nerd at heart. You know, that's who I am, and I'm proud of it. But as we were mentioning earlier, the jazz audience oftentimes leaves me wanting something more. And I've experienced more playing with Sufjan, and I've experienced more playing with Maria. Audiences of many different walks of life and different ages, but who have in common a need and an urge to find fulfilling music, right? Creatively and emotionally fulfilling music. And as we were saying, and a lot of jazz listeners aren't looking for that. They're looking for other things. And so one of the first things I'm looking to do is to try to get away from that trombonist moniker that goes next to my name. Because that's number one, that's the way the jazz world has always operated, is you're this or that as an instrumentalist, right? Or you're an arranger, you're a composer. Whereas outside of the jazz world, that's never a thing ever. You're an artist, right? You're a recording artist.
So what would you like to go next to your name when I post this episode?
Well, that's I haven't gotten to that. I haven't gotten that far yet. All I know is as long as people keep calling me trombonist, I'm always, that's going to be in part the audience. And I'm not saying I don't want that audience, but it makes it really difficult. It pigeonholes you. And I know that's obviously something everyone's always struggled with, Duke Ellington and
right.
Everyone ever since. But it's definitely an interesting thing that the jazz world has that others don't.
Ryan Keberle breaking out of his own house and then climbing back in through the window. As I mentioned earlier, one of the most profound musical experiences for Ryan came by working with Sufjan Stevens. Here in our final segment, we talk about the richness of that experience and then explore Ryan's thinking about making protest music, jazz education, working with words and lyrics, and his arrangement of Uruguayan songwriter and my friend Jorge Drexler's song, Al Otro Lado del Rio. As a side note, I produced the original recording of the song that Drexler performed, and for which he won an Oscar. Let's talk a little bit about the experience with Sufjan. How did you come to work with Sufjan Stevens, and how long did you work with him, and what was that like?
Well, like everything, just totally random connections, but also from my experience, like everything in my career that has kind of opened new doors, putting out positive energy and putting out, making it known that I love his music. You were
a fan.
I was a huge fan, and I knew his trumpet player, C.J. Camieri. And I had a couple of very good friends who had recorded with him in the past, Alan Ferber and Tim Albright, other trombonists. And
you knew that he was interested in trombones and working with horns.
So I let all these people know, man, if you ever need a sub, let me know. This is like my all-time favorite music. I would kill to have the opportunity to play his music someday live. And so that opportunity came to fruition, amazingly. It certainly was just right time, right place, knowing the right people. And it turned into a world tour for a better, over a year. Definitely one of the highlights of my career to this point. That was the Age of Odds tour. And after that, I did a number of recording sessions with him for other projects, and still would consider myself to be kind of part of his circle, and always send him my new records and kind of try to pick his brain and what he thinks. And still obviously a huge fan of his work as well. And actually, he's releasing a new project that I recorded on called Planetarium this summer. It's a trombone choir.
Were you focused on making music with lyrics, working with singers before you worked with Sufjan, or did you emerge from that experience thinking maybe having a singer in a project will help connect with an audience?
I never even considered using singers just because of the stigma in the jazz world.
The stigma because
commercialism, or I don't know what it is. And it's not even bad or good. It's just like either you are a musician who plays vocal music or you're a musician who plays instrumental music. And most of my circle of friends fall into the instrumental category. I never considered it, even looking back, being moved primarily by music with lyrics. I don't know why I never put the two and two together, but it took my manager and also my wife both independently suggesting that maybe I should consider using a vocalist on my music to even consider it. And when I first used it, though, it was still wordless vocals. Yeah. So it's in some ways it was still instrumental music.
When you first started using a singer in the band, was Camilla the first person that you worked with?
She was, yeah. I really lucked out. I mean, I did a lot of research and a lot of digging and a lot of thinking about it. But yeah, she was the first and only person to really ever sing our music. We've had a few subs over the years.
I saw you at Winter Jazz Festival.
With Sophia.
She was fantastic.
She's incredible,
also.
Yeah.
It really was kind of shocking to me. I think Camilla's wonderful. I think she's a wonderful artist. I think she is fantastic in Catharsis. I love her solo work. I think she's great. But it was a little shocking to me that there even exists another person who can read that stuff and also is a native Spanish speaker. And like, what kind of world are we living in where there's like more than one person that can cut that gig?
I know. New York is amazing.
Yes.
The list is short for sure. Sarah Serpis performed with us and killed it. We don't do the Spanish music in this case, but Shayna Steele, Shayna Cook,
Sure.
played with us once and totally killed it.
Yep.
And it is really fun to have, because that role, just naturally being a singer, is so personal. It's fun to see how different the music can sound.
By now, you've evolved to a place where you made a record where most of the material is chosen specifically because of the lyrical content. You had some lyrics commissioned for the record.
Yeah.
And pretty much any song that doesn't have lyrics is kind of an interstitial thing to get from one song to another.
Yeah.
So you really have evolved in your thinking about the role of lyrics and words and what songs mean.
I sure have. My 25-year-old self would not recognize the current iteration. I think he would have liked it, though. He would have liked the final product. But it's funny, as I said, there was this disconnect for so many years. Not to say that words weren't important to me, but still to this day, when I listen to music, I hear the words last. Mm-hmm. And that's the opposite. Talking about how people experience music, that's the opposite, right, of how most people experience music.
That's right.
So I think that was always a big part of it. They just weren't as important to me as they were for others. But now that we've opened that door, which just happened to coincide with a new class I started offering at Hunter College, where I direct the jazz program, called Intro to Songwriting, where I've actually been personally digging deeper into the art of lyric writing. All of this just kind of happened at once.
Did you start teaching it just this year?
Yeah.
So it showed up right as the presidential election fell in our lap.
Exactly. So all of this just kind of just happened at the same time, and when making a more direct political statement, which this record intends to do, on as wide of a scale as possible, and gearing it towards as broad of a listenership as possible, I decided words were the right approach. I really want the message to be clear.
It raises a good question, like, what is protest music without words?
I think symbolically, all music is protest music. All jazz, certainly, but really all creative music. I mean, the act of creation goes against many of the values that suppressive regimes have looked to wipe out. Mm-hmm. I think using that as a starting point, all it really takes is an album title or a song title to turn something into a very poignant protest piece. Mm-hmm. I think Charlie Hayden's a great example of that with the Liberation Orchestra. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think for me, I wanted this to be even more direct. I wanted this, having a vocalist and someone like Camila who speaks multiple languages and who is such a wordsmith, and whose approach is so emotional in the way that she interprets words. I really wanted to take advantage of that for this record.
I guess we have to spend a minute just talking about Al Otro Lado del Rio, because it's a very close one to my heart.
I know, it still blows my mind that I'm a huge fan of Jorge Drexler's as well, and you've spent quite a bit of time working with him.
Clavo mi remo en el agua, llevo tu remo en el mío, creo que he visto una luz al otro lado del río. El
The truth is I never really thought of it as a protest song. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one definitely has a level of symbolism.
Yes.
That can be interpreted different ways. But for me, just that idea of there being these perceived differences.
Yes.
Right, on either side of the river, and always kind of yearning for the other side, or, thinking that something's better around the corner. And I feel like that's something that I struggle with my own personal politics, because that attitude, it can really shut one down in terms of deciding how you want to pursue change, and whether that means, just not trying anything, just kind of throwing your hands up and giving up because it's just not worth it in your mind. Or there's points to that song that remind me of the echo chambers we live in nowadays, and not looking for what's on the other side. To me, that's a big part of it. Very few of us are even interested in knowing what's on the other side of the river now, because we don't have to. And that's a huge part of the problem that we have with the media as well. And so, yeah, I think definitely there's that stretch. You can take it in many different directions.
It also raises just a question for me that I'm asking every day, and I know a lot of my friends are, and that is, what do we do in the face of a political situation that we really don't agree with and that scares us?
Yeah.
And I guess I have to quote my dad again. My father always said jazz musicians are like the canaries in the coal mine. When they stop singing, that's when you better worry.
Wow.
And
I love that.
And the jazz musicians are singing extra loud right now. I mean, everybody I know is kind of like thinking, well, what can we do? And what is the value of music? What is the power of music? What contribution can we make through this music?
That's right.
As you say, I really appreciate you saying that. By just making the music, we are doing something,
Absolutely.
So let's talk about teaching, because in the midst of all of this, you are, you're running this jazz program.
Yeah. Well, Hunter College, it's a great public university in New York, part of the city university system, and really excellent school. It's got one of the best honors programs in the country. And we're consistently getting kids who turn down Harvard and Yale to come to Hunter on a full ride, and really great package deal. And that kind of coincided with my time leading the program there about 13 years ago now. And it's been a pleasure to work with.
So you were very young when you
I was
went.
extremely young when I started working there.
How old were you?
24. Yeah, I was teaching. I had a lot of students older than me.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, it's still to this day, it's a small program, very small, and it's also generally a kind of a program geared towards less experienced students. I mean, you're not coming there if you already know how to play jazz. You're going to go to a conservatory. So, but most of my students at Hunter, and most of the students at Hunter, are either first generation in their family to go to college, or paying their own way through college, or both those things. And that makes for an enormously satisfying student population to work with.
Does it give you a deeper sense of responsibility? I mean, you have somebody who could be the first one in their family to go to college, and they've chosen to study jazz with you.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say luckily, because jazz is not the profession I would offer up for most of my students. Most of my students aren't going to be jazz performers. A few of them are, and actually in the last few years I've had more and more. But a lot of them are music ed majors. Many of them are double majors. But I think the beauty in it is it's taught me how important music is and can be for a young adult who, even if they aren't going to be performers, can continue to enrich their lives. Even if it doesn't mean them actively performing, just making, my role as a jazz educator, as a music educator, is coming back to what we were talking about earlier, is to teach people how to listen and to try and impart on them the way that I hear music in detail and the subtleties that I'm experiencing, and hopefully trying to enlighten them to experience those same things. And it's really hard to do. And we don't really know how to do that either, because in the end, it's something the student has to discover on their own. But that's kind of that's my purpose. That's my credo. I would say that skill is so relevant in other walks of life, because to listen to music with that level of focus will make you a better listener for other people as well. Listening to your spouse, listening to your coworkers, and listening to your inner voice and, how to become a better person. So I see it as maybe a slightly more altruistic approach to education.
Yes, man. Yes. You're the first person to answer the question of jazz education in those terms to me. And I totally agree. But I suppose it's because I'm often talking to people about the conservatory model and the expense. And the question that to me is raised by, emerging with a jazz performance degree and a couple $100,000 in debt, that I actually think is like a real problem.
It's a real problem.
That we're not really dealing with.
And what's interesting to me, just to kind of take a sidebar, is you'd think with the tens of thousands of students graduating with undergrad jazz degrees these days over the last, say, 20 years, say over the period of time when the CD has slowly become obsolete, you'd think there would be a whole lot more people going out to hear music and buying records, because had these students been taught the way that I teach in terms of improving their listening, they would be consuming music in large quantities.
Yes.
Again, touching on another topic, they're not taught this way. Instead, they're taught to pursue the technical virtuosity that so many people identify with in jazz. And again, that is not what makes any kind of music great. It just isn't. Certainly there are a lot of great jazz educators out there. I could name a bunch. But I think it actually probably has less to do with the college approach and maybe more to do with how music is taught in junior high and high schools. Or maybe not taught at all.
Right.
In some situations. But if music education was seen more as just a general appreciation,
an enrichment.
I think that the arts in this country would be in a much better position than they are. The collegiate jazz model, it's problematic, and especially the fees that people are paying. And at the same time, what has happened in the last 10, 15 years is that an entirely new industry has been born, and one that, as long as it's around, I'm going to take advantage of. And it's actually primarily how we fund our tours. And I mean, we're not alone. I mean, I'm seeing even people like Joe Lovano, who now, when they tour in the U.S., are giving clinics at the local universities because there is a budget for that kind of event. And of course, that didn't used to have to be the case, because venues would pay a living wage and would cover transportation costs and lodging costs, and that doesn't happen now. So jazz musicians are entrepreneurs at heart, and we figure out a way to make it work. But the jazz education industry, which is what it is, it's a huge multi-million-dollar industry, does have its benefits, but the type of audience we're playing for in these situations is generally less than ideal. So for me, again, I've kind of made it my mission when I do these workshops to really focus on what it means to listen, and on what I'm listening to in my own music and other music, and on what I'm not listening to. And people ask me, well, who's your favorite trombone player? And I tell them, I love J.J. Johnson and Slide Hampton. These are heroes of mine. But, them playing a fast high lick does absolutely nothing for me when it comes to connecting to the music, and trying to just hopefully enlighten them as to what else there is in music that is so much more rewarding,
Ryan Keberle, thank you, man. It's such a pleasure to finally get to sit down and do this with you.
Pleasure is mine.
There it was, Ryan Keberle, trombonist. In addition to the episodes I suggested earlier, you may also like to check out the conversations with Jorge Drexler and Becca Stevens, both of whom are name-checked here. I'll be back with another great conversation next week. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.